Hi, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Oliver Broudy's here with us today. Sensitives, his brand new book, The Fascinating World of Environmental Illness. Oliver, how are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm getting through.
I'm right there with you. And I would imagine that the people that you wrote about in your book are kind of the same way all the time in terms of just getting through, but especially during COVID, I'm sure it's pretty fascinating. So why don't we talk about environmental illness? How did you kind of get exposed to this whole world, and what was it like writing about this whole world?
Okay. Well, I got exposed to it in the summer of 2016. I just sort of randomly stumbled across this community and was immediately fascinated for several reasons. First, because you couldn't really tell whether what they were experiencing was real or not. There was a great deal of debate as to whether this disease or syndrome or whatever you want to call it was a real thing. So there are some scientists and doctors who are saying, yeah, this is totally made up. These folks are just making this thing up. It's all in their head. And then you have people who are actually suffering from it, saying, actually, no. So, and this is sort of one of a subset of diseases. And this is sort of a familiar characteristic of all of them, is that you can't really tell if they're real or not. So, my thought was that if cancer was sort of the defining disease of the 20th century, surely this has got to be the defining disease of the 21st, simply because like so much else in the world we live in now, you can't really tell how real it is. Everyone is kind of living their own experiences and kind of pulling apart from each other, at the same time desperately trying to connect. So at the same time, there are all these people who are actually actively suffering. So in this suffering, no matter what you want to say about the disease, whether it's real or not, is real. The suffering is real. The pain is real. Not only that, but the suffering that they feel is like of a different order. So it's not just like a pain in the leg, but you got to understand, like, so there's a lot of people who suffer from environmental illness, but there's degrees of it. So, you may just have like a sensitivity to perfume or something. You might not like that. You might start feeling tight in the chest if, your company just cleaned your office and used some kind of chemical cleaner on the carpets. But it goes all the way to an extreme where, if you are, let's say that someone puts pesticide on the lawn next door, suddenly you can't think straight, you've got stabbing headaches, you're feeling exhausted. So this is like a different order of sensitivity. And the folks that I were interested in exhibited this kind of sensitivity. And it was to the extent that there was no place that they could really live anymore. So one sort of defining characteristic of them is that they were always moving from one house to the next, trying to find a habitat. And many of them, in fact, were called runners because that's what they did for a lot of their lives. They're just on the run, basically, on the run from civilization in a way. And there's no way they could stop. So a lot of them ended up in, national parks, Walmart parking lots, living out of cars that have been stripped of a lot of the electrical gear and electronics so it wouldn't mess with their heads. So in the end, you've run for so much and you're standing on this tiny little patch of land, maybe the only things you can really tolerate. And in effect, it's like you're living on an alien planet. So, the rest of us are pretty comfortable with our planet. Like we feel like we belong here. And it's hard to imagine what it's like to not feel that way, to feel like you're sort of an interloper in this world where you're just not at home. So there's like an existential tenor to this suffering that immediately captured my attention. Like, oh my God, what the hell is this like? How are these people dealing? So that was one level. And then the second level was, okay, let's look into this. Is this real thing? And how should we think about that? Especially as people who may have loved ones, friends, family who suffer from a disease like this, like how do we deal with them? We want to show them our empathy and our compassion. And then like on the other hand, you've got a doctor or a scientist saying, yeah, it's not real. So what are you supposed to do? If you have a disease like this or you're suffering from it, you're kind of stuck in a way. So that's sort of what drew me into it. All these questions were interesting to me.
Yeah, there's so many different questions to what you wrote about, and really just a sliding scale in terms of how people are impacted, not only physically, but mentally. And like, even when you're on the trip with James, like you start to kind of go through some mental things where you're thinking about the sheets in the hotel and the situation there. So what was it like for you to unpack the mental side of things? Because clearly, like, whether it's the perfume, the pesticides, or, you're on the run, there could be a physical thing, but like, there's a lot of mental warfare going on here, and really like even like a mental prison for some of these people. So what was it like unpacking the mental side of this part?
Well, it's very hard to know what the mix is of the physical and the mental, and part of it is because we don't really have a very good model for understanding still how those two things interrelate. And that was another piece of this book was taking a good hard look at that. In recent years, I think that the medical community has started responding to some of the shortfalls of the medical establishment. You see more like alternative medicine doctors coming out and speaking to people's needs where they're not being met. And there's more sort of an understanding and accommodation for the fact that some of people's sick experiences are not necessarily going to fall neatly into like an insurance code designation. But that shouldn't stop a doctor from trying to understand what the patient is going through and how they can be helped. So part of this is like a question of expertise. I think a lot of the way that we look at phenomena in the world is through the optic of expertise. So it's either medical expertise or psychological expertise or psychiatric expertise or whatever it may be. But and expertise is great. We've obviously suffered from a lack of it in recent years. But at the same time, expertise can be, I think, destructively myopic. There comes a point with some expertise where the expertise starts paying more attention to itself than that which is ostensibly kind of there to figure out. So like doctors fall into this a great deal. Like there's a term called heart sink patients. And these are patients that doctors can't figure out. And to a doctor, this is a huge irritation because especially if you're being pressured by an insurance industry or by the huge corporation that owns your hospital to move through these patients, here comes this disagreeable patient who doesn't have the good sense or courtesy to slip into one of these little designations, and it's irritating if you're a doctor. So at that point, you basically are a captive of your own expertise. You're no longer seeing the patient. You're only seeing the fact that they are not somehow in accord with what you already know. So expertise is very good at knowing what it does know, and sometimes not so good at understanding or even acknowledging the existence of what it doesn't. And so this is what you sort of find there on the border between the physical and the psychological. And it's a very squishy border, and this is the other reason why it's kind of hard to take apart and hard to understand. Like, as you say, like after 6 or 7 days driving around with James through the country and kind of attuning myself differently, I began to be aware of different elements in my environment and started asking questions about, whether this was having an effect on me, whether the volatile organic chemicals in the car were kind of causing some reaction, or the curtains in the hotel room, or the new tar that was recently laid down on the highway, or who knows, there's a coal plant puffing away on the horizon, or there's a point where we had to drive through this area of the country that is like the most swept with pesticides of the entire country. It's like a whole acres upon acres of cotton that are just doused in pesticides, and you go through it and you're listening to yourself. There's this kind of like internal attunement happens. And anyone who's ever been sick knows what this internal attunement feels like. As it's different than if you just cut your finger, at which point you can just look at your finger like, right. Am I hurt? Yes. But if you're sick, like even if it's just a fever or a cold, you may just sort of come to a halt and kind of try to feel inwardly and detect what the hell is going on, and we're all a little bit blind in that way. We can't really see our internal illness. We can't really see our white blood cells or whatever, the same way we can see the cut on our finger. So we're also a very imaginative creature. So it's very easy to start seeing things in the dark, and seeing things that aren't there. Maybe they are. It's hard to say.
Yeah, those are some great points. Environmental illness doesn't fit comfortably into a box. And also like the fact that people can just get this later on in their lives, they can live a certain way, and then all of a sudden, boom, things can change. Like there are a lot of really shocking revelations in the book. What was most surprising to you throughout the whole journey?
Oh, geez. Most surprising. I mean, there was some certainties that came out of the book for me. And ones that no matter what you say about environmental illness, there's some things that we know for sure. and that's that thyroid and cancer rates are up, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma rates are up, autism rates are up, allergies are up, male sperm counts are down. Like, these things are real, and there's a whole list of them. And nobody really knows why. There is a suspected connection to chemicals, our environment. And this makes kind of obvious sense because I forget what the numbers are. Like, the chemical industry dumps about 5 billion pounds a year into our environment, and the number's not really going down overall. And, you taken together with the amount of money that the chemical industry slathers on members of Congress, which is something like $100,000 per, which I personally can't compete with. The failure of the federal regulatory mechanism, the fact that there are about 85,000 synthetic chemicals on the market, which haven't been, by and large, tested either singly or in combination with each other. We just don't have like the regulatory muscle to deal. So all of this stuff is real. You can't really say for sure, like, this is causing that, but it's very hard to come up with like an alternative explanation. So one of the common motifs in the environmental community, environmental illness community, is that we are living through a vast human experiment. And I think that we probably are anyway. Like, we're all interested in the experiment because we're not sure how it's going to turn out. But in a much more real way, that these chemicals are in our environment. The regulatory mechanism is not particularly robust. And I forget, I think it was in the 70s or something, a law was passed that said you can't experiment on human beings. So technically, this kind of experimentation is illegal in a very specific sense, but in a broader sense, it's what we're doing every day. So, I don't really know where that leaves us, except to say that if we wanted to deal with this, we need to be much more explicit about it. And then we need to do all of the stuff that we all know that we need to do, like, very aggressively get the money out of politics and demand a better regulatory system. I could go on forever about how our old kind of posture towards risk has changed over the decades. It hasn't always been like this, where we've all just kind of gone along with it and be like, well, yeah, guess we're screwed. Maybe I'll buy organic lettuce and maybe I'll be all right. And again, maybe not. This is the way we're used to living these days, but it wasn't always this way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time that we're living in. Have you heard from Brian or James recently, or anybody else who wrote about?
Yeah, here and there. I mean, I've heard from James. He's doing better. I haven't heard from Brian. He may have disappeared. He may be dead. I don't know where he is. Some of the other characters I've heard from as well, and some are doing worse, some are doing better. It's not the kind of thing that goes away easily. As one of these characters said to me, it's kind of like being pregnant, except it just doesn't end. Like, it just goes on. and this is part of the cruelty of it. Like, some diseases at least have the courtesy of killing you. This one doesn't. Right. It'll stick around until you decide out of exhaustion to kill yourself, and a lot of people do. It's a common phenomenon in the community because there's nowhere left to go, and so despair is it's unavoidable.
Well, Oliver, thanks for jumping on. Thanks for giving voice to environmental illness. July 14th is a big day.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.